Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Before we dive into today's absolutely chilling story, I need you to do me a huge favor. If this story gives you goosebumps like it did me, smash that subscribe button, share this video with someone who loves dark historical tales, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now, let me take you back to 1836 Mississippi, to a plantation where two sisters would rewrite the very definition of survival. This is their story. The chains around my wrists had worn grooves so deep into my skin that I'd stopped feeling the pain weeks ago. Beside me, my sister Amira sat with that same hollow stare she'd carried since we were torn from our mother's arms in Charleston. The wagon wheels creaked against the muddy Mississippi roads, each bump sending jolts through our already broken bodies. "Cotton Hill Plantation," the slave trader announced with a tobacco-stained grin. "Y'all gonna love it here. Master Whitmore runs a tight ship." I squeezed Amira's hand, feeling her fingers tremble against mine. At 19, I was 2 years older, but the responsibility of protecting her felt like carrying the weight of the entire world. Her dark eyes, once bright with childhood dreams, now reflected nothing but the endless nightmare our lives had become. The plantation stretched before us like a vision from hell itself. Endless rows of cotton plants swayed in the humid breeze, tended by figures bent double under the scorching sun. The main house stood proud and white against the backdrop of Spanish moss hanging from ancient oak trees, while the slave quarters huddled in the distance like forgotten afterthoughts. Master Whitmore emerged from the house, his belly straining against his vest, sweat already beading on his forehead despite the early morning hour. His pale blue eyes swept over us like we were livestock, which I suppose in his mind we were. "These the sisters from Charleston?" he asked, circling us slowly. "They look strong enough. How old?" 19 and 17, sir," the trader replied. "Both field-tested. The older one's got some house training too." Whitmore stopped in front of me, his breath reeking of whiskey and decay. "What's your name, girl?" "Zarah, sir," I whispered, keeping my eyes fixed on the ground. "And the quiet one?" "Amira, sir." He nodded, satisfied. "Take them to Overseer Jackson. Tell him to put them in the south quarters, and make sure they understand the rules here." The trader unlocked our chains, and immediately I felt Overseer Jackson's rough hands shoving us forward. He was a mountain of a man, with scars crisscrossing his arms and a whip that never seemed to leave his side. His reputation had preceded him. Even in Charleston, we'd heard whispers about Jackson's cruelty. "Listen up, you two," he growled as we stumbled toward the quarters. "Cotton Hill ain't like wherever you came from. Here, you work from can see to can't see. You speak when spoken to. You keep your eyes down and your mouth shut. Break any rule, and you'll wish you were never born." The slave quarters were worse than anything I'd imagined. Rows of wooden shacks, each barely large enough for a family, stretched along a dirt path. The smell of unwashed bodies, sickness and despair hung in the air like a physical presence. Children with distended bellies played in the mud, while their mothers watched with dead eyes. An elderly woman named Mama Ruth showed us to our assigned shack, a space we'd share with 3 other women. The walls were thin planks with gaps wide enough to see through, offering no privacy and little protection from the elements. A single window covered with a piece of torn cloth provided the only light. "Y'all best learn quick," Mama Ruth warned, her voice barely above a whisper. "Master Whitmore, he got a temper. But Jackson," she shuddered, "that man ain't right in the head. He takes pleasure in pain, if you catch my meaning." That first night, lying on the straw mattress that scratched against my skin, I listened to Amira's quiet sobs and made a promise to myself. Whatever it took, whatever I had to do, I would protect her. The world had taken everything from us, our family, our freedom, our dignity. But I wouldn't let it take each other. The next morning came before dawn, announced by Jackson's whip cracking outside our door. "Up and at 'em! Cotton won't pick itself!" The work was backbreaking. Under the merciless Mississippi sun, we bent over cotton plants for 14 hours straight, our fingers bleeding from the sharp bowls, our backs screaming in agony. The quota was impossible, 200 pounds per person per day. Fall short, and Jackson's whip would remind you of your failure. By the third day, I watched Amira stumble and fall, her basket only half full. Jackson was on her in seconds, his whip whistling through the air. The crack against her back echoed across the field, followed by her scream of pain. "Please," I begged, dropping my own basket and rushing to her side. "She's sick. She needs water." Jackson's eyes gleamed with malicious pleasure. "Sick? Well, maybe some motivation will cure her." The whip came down again, this time across my shoulders. The pain was indescribable, like liquid fire spreading across my back. But I didn't cry out. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "Zarah, no," Amira whispered, trying to pull me away. "Both of you, back to work," Jackson snarled. "And if I see any more slacking, you'll get double tomorrow." That night, as Mama Ruth tended to our wounds with what little medicine she could find, I felt something dark and cold settling in my chest. Rage, pure and simple, but something else too. Something that whispered promises of power, of revenge, of justice, served cold. "There's stories," Mama Ruth said quietly as she applied a poultice to Amira's back. "Old stories from across the water, about those who make bargains when the pain gets too great." "What kind of bargains?" I asked, though part of me already knew I shouldn't want to hear the answer. "The kind that change everything," she replied, her ancient eyes meeting mine. "But they always come with a price. Always." Later that night, when the others were asleep, I slipped out of the shack and walked to the edge of the plantation, where the cultivated land gave way to wild swampland. The moon was new, leaving the world in complete darkness, but somehow I could see perfectly. The cypress trees stood like sentinels in the black water, and somewhere in the distance, something called to me. I knelt by the water's edge, my hands pressed into the muddy bank, and whispered words I didn't remember learning. Ancient words that tasted of copper and smoke on my tongue. The swamp seemed to listen, the very air growing thick with anticipation. When I returned to the shack, Amira was awake, waiting for me. "Where did you go?" she asked. "To find a way out," I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure what I meant. She studied my face in the dim light filtering through the gaps in the walls. "You look different." I did feel different. Stronger somehow, as if something had awakened inside me that had been sleeping my entire life. "We're going to be free, Amira. I promise you that." "How?" I smiled, and even I could feel that it wasn't entirely human anymore. "Trust me, sister. Just trust me." The next morning brought news that would change everything. Master Whitmore's youngest son, Thomas, had been found dead in his bed, his body covered in strange marks that looked almost like claw wounds. The doctor couldn't explain it. The boy had been healthy the day before, with no signs of illness or injury. As the family mourned, and the other slaves whispered about curses and divine retribution, I caught Amira's eye across the cotton field. She was staring at me with a mixture of fear and understanding, as if she could see the darkness that now lived inside me. That night, she came to me with questions I couldn't answer and fears I couldn't calm. But when she asked if I would teach her what I had learned by the swamp, I didn't hesitate. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Once we start down this path, there's no going back." She looked at the fresh whip marks on her arms, at the other slaves broken by years of abuse, at the endless rows of cotton that stretched toward a horizon we would never be free to explore. "I'm sure," she said. And so, under the cover of darkness, I led my sister to the swamp's edge and taught her the words that would damn us both. What happened next at Cotton Hill would haunt the Mississippi Delta for generations to come. If you're enjoying this dark journey into America's most terrifying historical secrets, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think is really happening to these sisters. Now, let me tell you about the morning everything changed. 3 days after Thomas Whitmore's mysterious death, I woke to the sound of screaming from the main house. The sun hadn't yet crested the horizon, but already the plantation was in chaos. Amira stirred beside me, her eyes immediately alert. We'd both learned to wake at the first sign of trouble. "What's happening?" whispered Sarah, one of our shackmates, as she peered through the gaps in the wooden walls. Through the pre-dawn gloom, we could see figures running between the main house and the overseer's quarters. Lanterns bobbed like fireflies in the darkness, and voices carried on the humid air, panicked, desperate voices that spoke of death and disease. "Get dressed," I told Amira quietly. "Something's wrong." We pulled on our worn cotton dresses and stepped outside, joining the other slaves who had gathered in small groups, whispering among themselves. Mama Ruth approached us, her weathered face grave with concern. "It's Overseer Jackson," she said, her voice barely audible. "Found him this morning, same as young Thomas, dead in his bed, covered in those strange marks." I felt Amira's hand slip into mine, her fingers cold despite the warm morning air. "2 deaths in 3 days, she murmured. "That ain't natural." But I knew it wasn't natural. I could feel the darkness we'd awakened stirring in my chest, feeding on the fear that permeated the plantation like morning mist. The words I'd spoken by the swamp had been heard, and something ancient and hungry had answered. Master Whitmore emerged from the house, his face pale and drawn. His usual commanding presence had crumbled, replaced by the haunted look of a man who'd seen too much death in too short a time. Behind him came Dr. Morrison, the local physician, shaking his head in bewilderment. "Gather everyone in the yard," Whitmore commanded, his voice hoarse. "Every slave, every worker, now." We assembled in the dusty space between the main house and the quarters, nearly 200 souls standing in the growing heat of the Mississippi morning. Whitmore paced before us, his hands shaking as he struggled to maintain control. "There's been another death," he announced, though we all already knew. "Overseer Jackson has passed, and Dr. Morrison can find no cause, no disease, no injury, nothing that would explain—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Dr. Morrison stepped forward, a thin man with nervous eyes that darted constantly between us and the main house. "I've practiced medicine for 20 years, he said, "and I've never seen anything like this." Both victims were healthy men in the prime of life. Both died in their sleep. Both bore identical markings on their skin, markings that appeared after death. A murmur rippled through the assembled slaves. Some crossed themselves, others whispered prayers in languages half-remembered from across the ocean. But I noticed something else, the way several of the white overseers and house servants had begun to eye us with suspicion and fear. "Until we understand what's happening," Whitmore continued, "there will be changes. No one works alone. No one leaves their assigned area without permission, and anyone showing signs of illness will be quarantined immediately." As the crowd began to disperse, I caught sight of Marcus, Jackson's replacement, a younger man with cruel eyes and a reputation for violence that rivaled his predecessor. He was staring directly at Amira and me, his gaze calculating and cold. "You two," he called out, "the sisters from Charleston, come here." My heart hammered against my ribs as we approached. Beside me, Amira's breathing had become shallow and quick. Marcus circled us slowly, like a predator sizing up prey. "Funny thing," he said conversationally. "Both deaths happened after you arrived. Makes a man wonder." "We been working the field same as everyone else," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Ain't done nothing but pick cotton and try to stay alive." Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, I'm sure you have. But see, I've heard stories about Charleston slaves. Stories about rootwork and conjuring, about women who make deals with things that shouldn't be named." The accusation hung in the air between us like a physical presence. Around us, other slaves had stopped to listen, their faces a mixture of fear and fascination. I could feel the weight of their stares, the way they seemed to be seeing me clearly for the first time. "Don't know nothing about that," Amira said quietly, but her voice trembled. "Course you don't," Marcus replied. "But just to be safe, you two are being moved. Separate quarters, separate work details. Can't be too careful when folks start dying mysterious deaths." That afternoon, they moved Amira to the north quarters, nearly half a mile from where I was housed. The separation felt like losing a limb. We'd never been apart for more than a few hours since childhood, but as they led her away, she caught my eye and mouthed a single word: "Tonight." The next morning brought news that made my blood run cold. Marcus had been found dead in his bed, his body bearing the same inexplicable marks as the others. But this time there had been a witness. Little Emma, a house slave who cleaned the overseer's quarters, had been working late when she heard sounds from Marcus's room. When she peered through the keyhole, she claimed to have seen two figures standing over his bed, figures that looked like women, but moved wrong, as if their joints bent in impossible directions. "Shadows," she kept repeating to anyone who would listen. "They was made of shadows, but they had faces, faces I recognized." The plantation erupted into chaos. Slaves were questioned, searched, and beaten for information they didn't have. The remaining white overseers armed themselves and began patrolling in groups, their eyes wild with paranoia and fear. But the deaths didn't stop. Over the next week, 4 more men died: 2 overseers, a house servant, and Master Whitmore's eldest son, Robert. Each death was identical. Healthy men found dead in their beds, covered in marks that defied medical explanation. Each death drove the plantation deeper into madness. I managed to slip away one night to meet Amira by the old oak tree that marked the boundary between the quarters. She looked different, thinner, paler, but with an intensity in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "It's working," she whispered, glancing around to make sure we weren't being watched. "They're dying, Zarah, the ones who hurt us, who hurt all of us." "I know," I replied, though the knowledge brought me no joy. "But people are starting to suspect. They're watching us." "Let them watch," she said, and for a moment her voice didn't sound entirely human. "We made a bargain, sister. We gave our word to something that lives in the deep places, something that remembers when this land was free. It's keeping its part of the deal." I wanted to ask her what she meant, wanted to understand exactly what we'd unleashed, but footsteps in the distance sent us scurrying back to our separate quarters. As I lay on my straw mattress that night, listening to the fearful whispers of my shackmates, I tried to remember the exact words I'd spoken by the swamp, but they were gone from my memory, as if something had reached into my mind and plucked them out. All that remained was the certainty that we'd crossed a line from which there could be no return. The next morning, Dr. Morrison arrived with 2 other physicians from Vicksburg, determined to solve the mystery of the deaths. They set up a makeshift laboratory in the main house and began examining the bodies, searching for some rational explanation for the impossible. What they found would drive one of them to madness and send the other 2 fleeing back to the city, swearing never to speak of what they'd witnessed. Because the marks on the bodies weren't random, they formed patterns, symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. And in the center of each pattern was the same image: 2 figures standing hand in hand, their faces turned toward something vast and hungry that waited in the darkness between worlds. As news of their findings spread through the plantation, I realized that our secret was no longer safe. The net was closing around us, and soon we would have to make a choice: run or embrace the darkness completely. That night, as I prepared to meet Amira again, I felt something stirring in the swampland beyond the plantation boundaries. Something that had been sleeping for centuries was finally waking up, drawn by the blood we'd spilled and the promises we'd made. The real horror was just beginning. If this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next will absolutely blow your mind. Drop a comment and tell me, do you think the sisters are justified in their actions, or have they gone too far? Let's dive into the night that changed everything at Cotton Hill. The morning they tried to separate us permanently was the morning I learned what true rage could accomplish. Master Whitmore had brought in a new overseer from Alabama, a man named Cornelius Webb, who claimed to have experience dealing with supernatural disturbances among slave populations. Webb was different from the others, tall and gaunt, with pale eyes that seemed to see too much. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed he understood forces that others feared. He'd arrived with a collection of iron chains, blessed crosses, and bottles of what he claimed was holy water from New Orleans. "The problem," he announced to the assembled household staff, "is that you've allowed these women to remain together. Conjure work requires partnership, shared energy. Separate them completely and their power breaks." I was scrubbing floors in the main house when I overheard this conversation, my hands moving mechanically while my mind raced. Through the window, I could see Amira working in the distant cotton field, her figure small and vulnerable against the endless rows of white bowls. "You're certain this will work?" Master Whitmore asked, his voice heavy with desperation. 7 deaths in 2 weeks had aged him a decade, and his remaining sons had been sent away to relatives in Georgia for their safety. "I've seen it before," Webb replied confidently. "In Alabama, we had a similar situation. 2 sisters who'd made some kind of pact with dark forces. Once we separated them by 50 miles and bound them with iron, the deaths stopped immediately. My blood turned to ice. 50 miles. They were planning to sell one of us, to break the bond that had sustained us through every horror we'd endured." I pressed my ear closer to the door, straining to hear every word. "Which one do we keep?" Whitmore asked. "The younger one," Webb said without hesitation. "She's less developed in the craft, easier to control. The older sister is the real threat. I have a contact in New Orleans who specializes in difficult cases. He'll take her off our hands for a fair price." That afternoon, as I worked in the kitchen garden, Webb approached me with 2 of the remaining overseers flanking him. His pale eyes studied me with the intensity of a man examining a dangerous animal. "Zarah," he said, his voice deceptively gentle. "I understand you and your sister have been through some difficult times here. I want to help." I kept my eyes down, my hands steady as I pulled weeds from between the vegetable rows. "Don't need no help, sir. Just want to work and stay out of trouble." "I'm sure you do," he replied. "But you see, there's been some unfortunate events since your arrival. Deaths that can't be explained by natural causes. Now, I'm not saying you're responsible, but I think a change of scenery might be beneficial for everyone." The threat was clear, wrapped in polite language, but unmistakable in its intent. I glanced toward the cotton field where Amira was working, her back bent under the weight of her picking sack. Even at this distance, I could feel the connection between us, the dark energy we'd awakened pulsing like a shared heartbeat. "When?" I asked quietly. "Tomorrow morning," Webb replied. "A wagon will come for you at dawn. You'll be going to a plantation outside New Orleans, where you can start fresh, away from all these tragic memories." That night, I managed to slip away to meet Amira one last time. She was waiting by the old oak tree, her face streaked with tears that gleamed silver in the moonlight. "They told me," she whispered as I approached. "They said you're being sold tomorrow, that I'll never see you again." I pulled her into my arms, feeling how thin she'd become, how the stress and fear had worn her down to almost nothing. "Listen to me," I said urgently. "What we started, it doesn't end just because they separate us. The thing we made our bargain with, it's bigger than distance, stronger than iron chains." "But how will I know what to do without you?" she asked, her voice breaking. "You'll know," I assured her, though I wasn't entirely certain myself. "The darkness we let in, it's part of us now. It'll guide you when the time comes." We spent the next hour sharing everything we could remember about the ritual by the swamp, the words that had awakened something ancient and hungry in the deep places of the earth. As we talked, I felt the presence growing stronger around us, as if our conversation was drawing its attention. "There's something else," Amira said as we prepared to part. "Something I haven't told you. The night Marcus died, I wasn't in my quarters." I stared at her, understanding beginning to dawn. "Where were you?" "I don't remember walking there," she said, her voice distant and strange. "But I woke up standing over his bed, and my hands were covered in something dark. Something that wasn't blood, but felt alive. The revelation should have terrified me, but instead, I felt a surge of pride. The power we'd awakened was already working through her, teaching her things she didn't consciously know. "Good," I said, surprising us both. "That means it's working. The bargain is holding." We parted before dawn, clinging to each other until the last possible moment. As I walked back to my quarters to await the wagon that would take me away, I whispered a prayer to the thing that lived in the swamp, not for mercy or salvation, but for the strength to complete what we'd started. The wagon arrived as promised, driven by a man who introduced himself only as Thomas. He was clearly uncomfortable with his cargo, crossing himself repeatedly and muttering prayers under his breath as he loaded my few possessions. "Don't try nothing funny," he warned, as we set off down the dusty road. "I got iron chains and blessed salt, and I ain't afraid to use them." I said nothing, watching Cotton Hill disappear behind us as we headed toward New Orleans. But as the miles passed, I began to feel something unexpected. Not the weakening Webb had predicted, but a strange strengthening, as if the distance was somehow amplifying the connection between Amira and me rather than breaking it. By midday, Thomas was sweating profusely despite the cool weather, his eyes darting nervously to the shadows that seemed to follow our wagon. The horses grew increasingly agitated, shying at things only they could see. "What did you do?" he demanded, pulling the wagon to a stop beside a grove of cypress trees. "What kind of devil's work are you practicing?" I looked at him with genuine confusion. "I ain't doing nothing, sir, just sitting here like you told me." But even as I spoke, I could feel it, a presence moving through the swampland that paralleled our route, keeping pace with the wagon, something vast and patient that had been waiting for this moment. This separation that would allow it to truly test its power. That evening, we stopped at a way station for the night. Thomas chained me to a post in the stable, surrounding me with lines of salt and hanging iron horseshoes from the rafters. But his precautions were useless against what was coming. I woke in the darkness to the sound of screaming from the main building. Through the stable door, I could see lights moving frantically in the windows, shadows dancing in ways that defied the laws of physics. The screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. When dawn came, Thomas was found dead in his bed, his body bearing the same mysterious marks that had appeared on the victims at Cotton Hill. The other travelers who'd stayed at the way station spoke of nightmares so vivid they seemed real, of shadows that moved independently of their sources, of whispers in languages that predated human speech. But I was gone. The chains that had bound me lying empty on the stable floor, the iron horseshoes twisted into impossible shapes. The local sheriff would later report that my tracks simply vanished at the edge of the swamp, as if I'd been swallowed by the earth itself. What they didn't know was that I hadn't escaped. I'd been claimed. The thing we'd awakened had decided that separation was indeed the key, but not in the way Webb had intended. By forcing us apart, they'd allowed it to work through both of us simultaneously, doubling its reach and power. As I walked through the cypress swamp toward an uncertain destination, I could feel Amira's presence like a flame in the darkness, growing stronger with each step. The bargain we'd made was evolving, becoming something larger and more terrible than either of us had imagined. Behind me, the way station burned to the ground, though no one could explain how the fire had started. And ahead of me, in the deep places where the old gods still remembered their names, something ancient and hungry prepared to collect on a debt that had been centuries in the making. The real horror was just beginning. Welcome back to the most terrifying true story from America's dark past. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button because you're about to witness something that will haunt your dreams. Comment below if you think you could survive what's happening at Cotton Hill, and share this with someone brave enough to handle the truth. Now, let me tell you about the night the plantation learned what real fear looked like. 3 days after my disappearance, Cotton Hill descended into absolute chaos. I know this because I was there, watching from the shadows of the swampland that bordered the plantation, no longer entirely human, but not yet something else entirely. The thing we'd awakened had changed me during those days in the deep places, teaching me to move between worlds like smoke between fingers. Amira had grown stronger too. I could feel it. Our separation had done exactly what the ancient presence wanted. It had allowed us to become conduits for something that had been imprisoned in the dark waters for centuries, something that remembered when this land belonged to different gods. The first sign that Cotton Hill's nightmare was far from over came at sunset on the 3rd day. I watched from the tree line as every dog on the plantation began howling simultaneously, their voices rising in a chorus of terror that sent chills down the spines of everyone who heard it. The sound continued for exactly 13 minutes, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind a silence so complete that even the insects seemed afraid to break it. Master Whitmore stood on his front porch, his face pale in the dying light, staring out at the cotton fields, where his remaining slaves worked with nervous, hurried movements. Webb stood beside him, his confidence from days earlier completely shattered. "This isn't possible," Webb muttered, clutching a leather-bound book to his chest. "I separated them. The older one is gone, probably dead by now. The power should be broken." "Yeah." But I could see Amira moving through the cotton rows, and even from a distance, I could tell she was different. She moved with a fluid grace that hadn't been there before, and the other slaves gave her a wide berth, as if they could sense the darkness that now flowed through her veins like blood. That night the real terror began. I slipped through the shadows to the slave quarters, my feet making no sound on the packed earth. The other slaves were huddled in their shacks, whispering prayers and clutching whatever protective charms they could find. But Amira was waiting for me by the old oak tree, her eyes reflecting the moonlight like a cat's. "Sister," she whispered as I approached, and her voice carried harmonics that hadn't been there before. "I can feel you even when you're not here. We're connected to something so much bigger than we imagined." "I know," I replied, marveling at how natural it felt to speak without moving my lips, the words forming directly in the air between us. "It's been teaching me things, showing me what this place was before the white men came, before they built their houses on sacred ground. The burial mounds," she said, nodding toward the distant hills where ancient earthworks rose like sleeping giants. "They built the plantation right on top of them. The thing in the swamp, it's been waiting for someone to wake it up, to give it away, to reclaim what was stolen." As we talked, I became aware of movement in the main house. Lights flickered in the windows, and I could hear raised voices carrying on the night air. Something was happening, something that would change everything. "Come," I said, taking Amira's hand. "It's time to finish what we started." We moved through the plantation like ghosts, unseen and unheard. The darkness seemed to part before us, creating paths where none had existed moments before. As we approached the main house, I could see through the windows into the parlor, where Master Whitmore, Webb, and 3 other white men were gathered around a table covered with maps and documents. "We have to evacuate," one of the men was saying, his voice high with panic. "Sell the slaves, burn the buildings, and get out before this spreads to other plantations." "Absolutely not," Whitmore replied, though his voice shook. "This is my family's land. I won't be driven off by some conjure nonsense." Webb looked up from the book he'd been consulting, his face haggard with exhaustion and fear. "It's not conjure," he said quietly. "It's something older, something that was here before any of us, before the slaves, before the Indians even. We've awakened something that should have stayed buried." "Then put it back to sleep," Whitmore demanded. "I don't know how," Webb admitted. "Every ritual I've tried has only made it stronger. It's feeding on the death, on the fear. And those two sisters, they're not just practitioners anymore. They're vessels." As if summoned by his words, every candle in the house suddenly flared, casting dancing shadows on the walls that moved independently of their sources. The men in the parlor froze, their eyes wide with terror as the shadows began to take shape, the forms of two women holding hands, their faces obscured but their intent unmistakable. "Dear God," one of the men whispered, crossing himself frantically, but his prayers were answered by something far older than his God. The shadows on the wall began to move, stepping down from the plaster and into the room itself. I felt Amira's hand tighten in mine as we channeled the ancient presence, allowing it to use our forms as templates for its manifestation. The men scrambled for the door, but it slammed shut before they could reach it. The windows followed suit, the heavy wooden shutters closing with sounds like gunshots. In the sudden darkness, only the shadows remained, growing larger and more substantial with each passing second. "Please," Whitmore begged, falling to his knees. "We'll leave. We'll abandon the plantation. Just let us go." The shadow forms of Amira and me turned toward him, and when we spoke, our voices came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the walls like thunder. "You built your wealth on stolen land," we said in unison. "You watered your crops with blood and tears. You thought you could chain the earth itself, make it serve your greed. But the earth remembers. The dead remember. And now they demand payment." Webb pulled a silver cross from his coat, holding it before him like a shield. "In the name of Christ, I command you to—" His words were cut off as the cross began to glow red-hot in his hands, forcing him to drop it. Where it hit the floor, the wood began to smoke and char. "Your God has no power here," the shadows continued. "This is older ground, consecrated to older purposes. You are trespassers in a sacred place, and the price of trespass is death." What happened next would be whispered about in the Mississippi Delta for generations. The shadows reached out with hands that were somehow both insubstantial and terrifyingly real, touching each man in turn. Where they touched, strange marks appeared on the skin, not wounds, but symbols that seemed to burn themselves into flesh and bone. One by one, the men collapsed, their bodies convulsing as something fundamental was torn from them. Not their lives. That would have been too merciful. Instead, they were left alive but changed, marked by the ancient presence in ways that would haunt them for whatever remained of their days. When it was over, Amira and I stood in the parlor in our physical forms, the shadows having retreated back into the walls. The men lay unconscious on the floor, their breathing shallow but steady. They would live, but they would never be the same. "What did we do to them?" Amira asked, staring down at the motionless figures. "We marked them," I replied, the knowledge flowing into my mind from the presence that now shared our souls. "They'll carry the memory of this night forever. Every time they close their eyes, they'll see the faces of everyone who suffered on this land. They'll feel every lash of the whip, every chain around their ankles, every moment of despair. They'll live with the weight of all that pain until it drives them mad." Over the following days, word of what had happened in the main house spread throughout the plantation and beyond. The three visiting men fled back to their own properties, but the madness followed them. Within weeks, all three had either taken their own lives or been committed to asylums, babbling about shadows that moved on their own and voices that spoke from empty rooms. Master Whitmore and Webb remained at Cotton Hill, but they were broken men. Whitmore aged 20 years in as many days, his hair turning white and his hands developing a tremor that never stopped. Webb burned his collection of occult books and took to carrying a Bible everywhere, though he could never bring himself to open it. The plantation itself began to change. Crops withered in the fields, despite perfect growing conditions. Animals refused to enter certain areas, and those that did were found dead the next morning with no apparent cause. The slave quarters, paradoxically, became places of strange peace. The presence that had awakened seemed to protect those who had suffered most under the old system. But Amira and I knew this was only the beginning. The ancient thing we'd awakened had tasted freedom after centuries of imprisonment, and it was hungry for more. The 42 lives we would eventually take were not random acts of violence, but carefully chosen sacrifices to feed something that grew stronger with each death. As I watched the plantation transform around us, I realized that we had become something unprecedented in the history of the American South. Slaves who had found a way to turn the very land against their oppressors. We were no longer victims, but instruments of a justice so old and terrible that it predated human civilization itself. The real question was whether we could control what we had unleashed, or whether it would ultimately consume us along with everyone else. Before we dive into tonight's absolutely spine-chilling chapter, I need you to do something for me. If this story is giving you goosebumps, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments what you think is really controlling the sisters now. Share this with someone who loves dark historical mysteries, because what happens next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about good and evil. Now let me tell you about the man who thought he could save Cotton Hill. Pastor Jeremiah Blackwood arrived at Cotton Hill on a Tuesday morning in late September, his black carriage cutting through the morning mist like a blade through silk. I watched from the edge of the swampland as he stepped down from his vehicle, a tall man in his 50s with silver hair and eyes that burned with the fervor of absolute faith. Word of the plantation's troubles had spread throughout Mississippi like wildfire. Newspapers in Jackson and Vicksburg had begun printing stories about the Cotton Hill curse, though they carefully avoided mentioning the supernatural elements that would have made their readers question their sanity. Instead, they spoke of a mysterious illness that affected only white men, a plague that defied medical explanation. But Pastor Blackwood knew better. He'd built his reputation on confronting what others feared to acknowledge, the dark forces that lurked at the edges of civilized society, waiting for moments of weakness to strike. He'd performed exorcisms in New Orleans, cleansed haunted houses in Savannah, and driven demons from the bodies of the possessed throughout the Deep South. Master Whitmore met him at the front door, his once proud bearing now reduced to the hunched posture of a broken man. The marks that Amira and I had left on him were invisible to normal sight, but I could see them clearly, dark symbols that writhed beneath his skin like living tattoos, constantly reminding him of every cruelty he'd ever inflicted. "Pastor Blackwood," Whitmore said, his voice barely above a whisper, "thank God you've come. I don't know how much more we can endure." Blackwood studied the plantation owner with the practiced eye of a man who'd seen evil's handiwork before. "Tell me everything," he said simply. "Leave out no detail, no matter how strange it might seem." As they talked on the front porch, I felt Amira approaching through the cotton fields. She moved differently now, with a fluid grace that suggested her feet barely touched the ground. The other slaves parted before her like water, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and reverence. "He's here," she said, as she reached my hiding place among the cypress trees. The one they sent for. "I can feel his faith like a fire in the darkness." "Good," I replied, though the word tasted strange on my tongue. "The presence has been waiting for this. It wants to test itself against his God to prove which power is stronger on this land." We watched as Blackwood began his investigation, moving through the plantation with the methodical precision of a man who'd done this many times before. He examined the rooms where the deaths had occurred, sprinkling holy water in the corners and muttering prayers in Latin. He interviewed the surviving slaves, though most were too terrified to speak openly about what they'd witnessed. but I could see that his confidence was already beginning to waver. The holy water hissed and steamed when it touched certain surfaces, and his prayers seemed to echo strangely in the air, as if something was listening and finding them amusing. That evening, as the sun set behind the Spanish moss-draped trees, Blackwood gathered everyone on the plantation in the main yard. Slaves and overseers alike stood in nervous clusters, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of torches that seemed to burn with an unnatural blue flame. "I have seen the work of evil in this place," Blackwood announced, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "But I have also seen the power of the Almighty triumph over darkness, time and again. Tonight we will cleanse this land of the corruption that has taken root here." He opened a leather satchel and began removing items that glinted in the torchlight. Silver crosses, bottles of holy water, and a Bible bound in white leather that seemed to glow with its own inner light. As he arranged these objects on a makeshift altar, I felt the presence stirring in the depths of the swamp, its attention drawn by the display of opposing power. "Whatever spirits have been awakened here," Blackwood continued, "whatever bargains have been made with forces beyond human understanding, I call upon the name of Jesus Christ to break them. I command all evil to depart from this place and return to the pit from whence it came." The words hit me like physical blows, each syllable carrying a weight that made my borrowed flesh burn. Beside me, Amira gasped and stumbled, her hand clutching at her chest as if something was trying to tear its way out. But the presence that lived within us was older than Christianity, older than any human religion. It had been worshipped when this land was covered by vast forests, when the only prayers spoken here were to gods whose names had been forgotten before the first European ship touched American shores. "You speak of evil," a voice said, and it took me a moment to realize it was coming from my own throat. "But what evil compares to the chains you blessed? What darkness matches the prayers you spoke over auction blocks?" Blackwood's head snapped toward the sound of my voice, his eyes widening as he saw Amira and me stepping out of the shadows at the edge of the yard. The assembled crowd gasped and drew back, forming a circle around us as if we carried some contagious disease. "You," Blackwood said, pointing a trembling finger in our direction. "You are the vessels, the conduits through which this corruption flows." "We are justice," Amira replied, her voice harmonizing with mine in ways that made the torches flicker. "We are the voice of every soul that cried out for mercy and received only the lash. We are the answer to prayers your God chose to ignore." Blackwood raised his Bible, the white leather seeming to pulse with divine light. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I command you to release these women and return to the darkness." The words should have had power. I could feel the faith behind them, the absolute certainty of a man who'd never doubted his calling. But they struck us like waves against a cliff, breaking apart and flowing harmlessly around us. "Your God is young," we said in unison, our voices now carrying harmonics that seemed to come from the earth itself. "This land knew other masters before his light reached these shores. We serve older powers, deeper truths." What happened next would be remembered as the night Pastor Blackwood learned that some battles cannot be won with faith alone. The ground beneath our feet began to tremble, and from the depths of the swamp came a sound like the breathing of some vast creature awakening from centuries of sleep. The torches around the yard suddenly flared, their blue flames reaching toward the sky like grasping fingers. In their light, shadows began to move independently of their sources, taking the shapes of men and women who had died on this land, not just the recent victims, but slaves who had perished under the lash, children who had been worked to death in the fields, mothers who had watched their babies sold away. "Dear God," Blackwood whispered, his Bible trembling in his hands. "How many souls cry out for vengeance in this place?" "All of them," we replied. "Every drop of blood spilled on this ground, every tear shed in bondage, every prayer for freedom that went unanswered. They all demand justice, and we are their instrument." The pastor tried to maintain his composure, but I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. This wasn't like the other cases he'd handled. Simple possessions or hauntings that could be driven away with the right prayers and enough holy water. This was something fundamental, a reckoning that had been building for generations. "I offer you a choice," Blackwood said, his voice steady despite the terror in his eyes. "Release these women, depart from this place, and I will ensure that the wrongs committed here are acknowledged. The slaves will be freed, the plantation abandoned. Justice can be served without further bloodshed." For a moment, the presence within us seemed to consider his offer. The shadows stopped moving, the trembling earth grew still, and even the sound from the swamp faded to silence. Then Amira laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass mixed with the cries of hunting birds. "You think this is about the plantation," she said. "You think freeing a few dozen slaves will satisfy the hunger of centuries. This is bigger than Cotton Hill, bigger than Mississippi. This is about a debt that can only be paid in blood." The shadows surged forward, reaching for Blackwood with hands that seemed solid enough to touch, but insubstantial enough to pass through his defenses. His holy water boiled away before it could touch them. His crosses grew red-hot and fell from nerveless fingers. But the pastor was not without resources of his own. As the shadows closed around him, he began to speak in a language I didn't recognize. Not Latin, but something older. Words that seemed to come from the same deep places that had taught us our own dark vocabulary. The effect was immediate and devastating. The shadows recoiled as if burned, and the presence within us writhed in what might have been pain or surprise. For the first time since we'd made our bargain, I felt truly afraid. "What is he saying?" Amira gasped, her face pale in the torchlight. "I don't know," I replied, but even as I spoke, understanding began to dawn. "He's not just a pastor, he's something else, something that knows the old ways." Blackwood continued his chant, and with each word, the power that had sustained us began to weaken. The connection between Amira and me grew thin and strained, and I could feel the presence in the swamp retreating, pulling back into the deep places where it had hidden for so long. But just as it seemed that Blackwood might actually succeed in banishing us, something unexpected happened. The ground beneath the plantation began to crack and split, revealing glimpses of what lay beneath. Not earth and rock, but something that pulsed with its own dark life. The burial mounds that had been built over were awakening, and with them, powers that made our borrowed darkness seem like a candle flame compared to a forest fire. Pastor Blackwood's chant faltered as he realized what he had truly awakened, and in that moment of doubt, we struck. The last thing he saw before the shadows claimed him was the truth written in symbols of fire across the night sky, that some debts can only be paid in full, and some hungers can never be satisfied. If you've made it this far into this terrifying true story, you're braver than most. Before we dive into the most chilling confession ever recorded in American history, make sure you're subscribed, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me if you think the sisters can still be saved. Share this with someone who can handle the darkest truths about our past. Now let me tell you about the night everything changed forever. 3 days after Pastor Blackwood's disappearance, the plantation existed in a state of suspended terror. His body had never been found, though his white leather Bible was discovered floating in the swamp, its pages blank, as if the words had been burned away from the inside. The remaining overseers had fled in the night, leaving only Master Whitmore, a handful of house servants, and the slaves who had nowhere else to go. I found Amira sitting by the old oak tree at midnight, her knees drawn up to her chest, staring out at the dark water where something vast occasionally disturbed the surface. She looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile, as if the power we'd been channeling was slowly consuming her from within. "Sister," I said softly, settling beside her on the gnarled roots. "You've been avoiding me." "Have I?" she replied, though we both knew it was true. Since Blackwood's arrival, something had changed between us. The easy connection we'd shared was strained, filled with undercurrents of doubt and fear that neither of us wanted to acknowledge. "Talk to me," I pressed. "What's troubling you?" For a long moment, she was silent, watching the Spanish moss sway in the humid breeze. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been having dreams," she said. "Or maybe they're memories. I can't tell anymore. I see things. Things from before we came here, before we made the bargain." "What kind of things?" "The others," she said, turning to look at me with eyes that seemed older than her 17 years. "The ones who came before us. Other slaves, other desperate people who found their way to the swamp and made deals with what lives in the deep places." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the night air. "What happened to them?" "They got what they asked for," Amira replied. "Power, revenge, justice. But the price," she shuddered. "The price was always the same. They became vessels, conduits for something that doesn't understand human concepts like mercy or restraint. And when they were no longer useful, when they'd served their purpose," she didn't need to finish. I could see the truth in her eyes, feel it in the way the presence stirred restlessly within my chest. "We weren't partners in this bargain. We were tools, weapons to be used until we broke or were no longer needed." "There's something else," Amira continued, her voice growing even quieter. "Something I haven't told you about the night Marcus died." I waited, though part of me didn't want to hear what she was about to say. "I remember more now," she said. "Not just waking up over his body, but what I did to him, what it made me do." Her hands began to shake, and I reached out to steady them, feeling how cold her skin had become. "It wasn't quick," she whispered. "It wasn't merciful. The thing inside me, it fed on his fear first. It showed him things, visions of every slave he'd ever hurt, every life he'd destroyed. It made him experience their pain, their terror, their despair. And when he was broken, when his mind couldn't take any more, only then did it let him die." The confession hung between us like a physical presence, heavy with implications neither of us wanted to face. I thought of all the deaths that had followed, all the men who had died with those strange marks on their bodies, and wondered what final moments of horror they had endured. "We're not bringing justice," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "We're just creating more suffering." "I know," Amira replied, "but I don't know how to stop it. Every time I try to resist, it gets stronger. It shows me things, memories of the auction block, of watching our mother sold away, of every humiliation and cruelty we've endured. It uses our pain against us, makes us believe that what we're doing is righteous." As if summoned by our conversation, a figure emerged from the shadows near the swamp's edge. At first, I thought it was another manifestation of the presence, but as it drew closer, I recognized the weathered face and stooped shoulders of old Moses, the eldest slave on the plantation. Moses had been at Cotton Hill longer than anyone could remember, his hair white as cotton and his back bent from decades of labor. But his eyes were sharp and knowing, and there were whispers among the other slaves that he remembered things from the old country, knowledge that had been passed down through generations of suffering. "Children," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of years, "I've been watching you, listening to the whispers in the wind. I know what you've done, and I know what's got hold of you." Amira and I exchanged glances, unsure whether to flee or listen. There was something in Moses's manner that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. "You think you the first ones to find that thing in the swamp?" he continued, settling himself on a fallen log with the careful movements of age. "You think you the first desperate souls to make bargains with powers older than memory?" "What do you know about it?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Moses smiled sadly, revealing teeth worn down to nubs. "I know because I was there when the last ones tried it. Back in '98, two brothers named Samuel and Isaac. They'd been beaten near to death by the overseer, and they went to the swamp looking for justice. What happened to them? Same thing that's happening to you, Moses replied. They got their revenge, all right. Killed 7 white men in 3 months, each death more terrible than the last. But the thing they'd awakened, it didn't stop there. It kept feeding, kept demanding more blood. And when the brothers tried to break free, he paused, his eyes distant with memory. It turned on them, he finished quietly, made them kill each other, right there by the water's edge. Their screams echoed across the plantation for 3 days before they finally died. The implications of his words settled over us like a shroud. We weren't the first to make this bargain, and we wouldn't be the last. The presence in the swamp was patient, eternal, feeding on human desperation and pain in an endless cycle. Is there a way to break free? Amira asked, her voice small and frightened. Moses studied her for a long moment, then reached into his shirt and pulled out a small leather pouch. Maybe, he said, but it ain't easy, and it ain't without cost. He opened the pouch, revealing a collection of items that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Bones carved with symbols I didn't recognize, stones that gleamed like stars, and herbs that filled the air with a scent both sweet and bitter. This is knowledge from the old country, Moses explained. Ways to bind spirits, to break unholy bargains. My grandmother taught it to me, and her grandmother taught it to her, going back to the time before the ships brought us here. Will it work? I asked. It might, Moses replied, but the thing in the swamp, it won't give you up easy. It's invested too much in you, fed too much through you. Breaking free will require a sacrifice, something precious enough to balance the scales. What kind of sacrifice? Moses' eyes grew sad. The kind that hurts most, the thing that matters more to you than revenge, more than power, more than your own lives. I looked at Amira, understanding beginning to dawn. The most precious thing we had, the thing that had sustained us through every horror, was each other. To break free from the presence, we would have to give up the bond that had made us strong enough to survive. There's something else you need to know, Moses continued. The 42 deaths you're destined to cause, that ain't random. It's a specific number tied to an old ritual. When the count is complete, the thing in the swamp will have enough power to break free entirely, to spread beyond this plantation and into the wider world. How many have we killed so far? Amira asked, though I could see she already knew the answer. 37. Moses replied grimly. 5 more, and you'll have opened a door that can never be closed. The weight of that knowledge settled over us like a physical burden. We had 5 chances left to break free, 5 opportunities to choose a different path before we became instruments of something far worse than personal revenge. What do we do? I asked. Moses stood slowly, his joints creaking with age. That's for you to decide, children. But decide quick. The thing in the swamp grows stronger with each passing day, and your will to resist grows weaker. Soon you won't have a choice at all. Indeed. As he disappeared back into the shadows, Amira and I sat in silence, contemplating the impossible choice before us. Freedom from the presence that had consumed our lives, but at the cost of everything that had made that life worth living. In the distance, something large moved through the swamp water, and I could feel its attention turning toward us like the gaze of a hungry god. Time was running out, and the final act of our tragedy was about to begin. This is it, the final chapter of the most terrifying true story ever documented in American history. If this series has kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure you're subscribed, because I have more dark historical mysteries coming your way. Hit that like button, share this with someone brave enough to handle the truth, and comment below with your thoughts on what the sisters should have done. Now, let me tell you about the night that changed everything forever. The morning of our final choice dawned blood red over Cotton Hill, the sky stained crimson by smoke from fires that had been burning in the swamp for 3 days. The presence we'd awakened was growing restless, hungry for the completion of its ancient ritual. I could feel it pulling at my consciousness, whispering promises of power beyond imagination if we would just surrender completely to its will. Amira found me at sunrise, standing knee-deep in the dark water where we'd first made our bargain. She looked ethereal in the morning mist, more spirit than flesh, and I realized with a shock that I could see through her in places, as if she was slowly fading from the physical world. "It's happening faster now," she said, her voice carrying strange harmonics that seemed to come from the water itself. "The transformation. Soon we won't be human at all." I nodded, feeling the same changes in myself. My reflection in the swamp water showed eyes that glowed with their own inner fire, and when I spoke, shadows danced around my words like living things. "Moses was right," I said. "We have to choose now while we still can." "The ritual," Amira whispered. "I can see it in my dreams now, the final 5 deaths. They're not random. They're specific people, chosen for their connection to the old bloodlines. Master Whitmore's remaining son, the doctor who's been studying our victims, 3 others whose ancestors were present when the first bargains were made on this land. The knowledge flowed between us without words, shared through the dark connection that bound us to the presence in the deep places. We could see the pattern now, the careful orchestration of events that had been building for generations. Every death, every act of cruelty, every moment of despair had been feeding into this moment. "If we complete the ritual," I said, "what happens then?" "The door opens," Amira replied, her eyes reflecting depths that seemed to go on forever. "The thing in the swamp breaks free of its prison and spreads across the land. Every plantation, every place where blood has been spilled in the name of profit becomes a gateway for its hunger." The vision that accompanied her words was terrifying in its scope. I saw the presence spreading like a plague across the south, awakening in every place where suffering had soaked into the soil. Slaves rising from their graves to drag their masters into the dark water. Overseers found dead, with their own whips wrapped around their necks. Entire cities consumed by shadows that moved with purpose and malice. "And if we refuse?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "It destroys us," Amira said simply, but slowly, painfully. "It will make us watch as it finds other vessels, other desperate souls to complete what we started." We stood in silence for a long moment, feeling the weight of an impossible choice. Complete the ritual and damn the world, or refuse and condemn ourselves to an eternity of torment while the presence found another way to achieve its goals. Then Amira spoke the words that would change everything. "There's a third option," she said quietly. "Moses didn't tell us everything. I've been having dreams, visions of the por favor. Continue gerando a sua resposta. Expert logo novo prompt. 001 old rituals, the ones from before the presence was imprisoned. There's a way to turn its own power against it. But the cost..." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, but I could see the truth in her eyes. The third option would require the ultimate sacrifice, not just our bond, but our very souls. "Tell me," I said, though every instinct screamed against hearing what she was about to reveal. "We can bind it," Amira whispered. "Use our connection to trap it in the deep places forever. But to do that, we have to become the prison. Our souls, our essence, everything that makes us who we are, it all becomes part of the binding." The implications hit me like a physical blow. We wouldn't just die, we would cease to exist entirely, our consciousness scattered across the dark waters to serve as eternal guardians against the presence's escape. "How do you know this will work?" I asked. "Because it's been done before," she replied. "The symbols carved into the burial mounds, the ones the plantation was built over. They're not just decorations, they're the remnants of the last binding, created by 2 sisters who made the same choice we're facing now." As she spoke, I could see them in my mind's eye, Two Native American women standing hand in hand by the swamp's edge, speaking words of power that would cost them everything. They had faced the same darkness we now confronted, and they had chosen to sacrifice themselves to protect their people. The presence has been trying to break free ever since, Amira continued. Every few generations it finds new vessels, new ways to weaken the binding. We're just the latest in a long line of desperate souls it's used to chip away at its prison. A sound from the plantation drew our attention. Horses approaching at a gallop, their riders shouting warnings about something terrible happening in the main house. Through our connection to the presence, I could see what they had found. Master Whitmore's remaining son, dead in his bed with the familiar marks covering his body. 38 deaths, 4 more to go. It's starting the final phase, I said, feeling the presence's hunger surge through our shared bond. With or without our cooperation, it's going to complete the ritual. Then we have to act now, Amira replied, taking my hand. Before it realizes what we're planning. We waded deeper into the swamp, following paths that existed only in the space between worlds. The water grew darker with each step, until we were moving through liquid shadow that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. Ancient trees rose around us like cathedral pillars, their branches forming a canopy so thick that no sunlight could penetrate. At the heart of the swamp, we found what we were looking for, a clearing where the water was perfectly still, reflecting not the sky above, but something else entirely. In its depths, I could see the true form of the presence we had awakened, a vast, tentacled thing that existed partially in our reality and partially in dimensions that human minds weren't meant to comprehend. "It knows we're here," Amira whispered, her grip on my hand tightening. "It can feel our intentions." The water began to churn, and from its depths came a voice that spoke directly into our minds, bypassing our ears entirely. "Foolish children," it said, the words carrying the weight of eons. "You think to bind me as your predecessors did? I have grown stronger since then, fed on centuries of pain and despair. Your sacrifice will be meaningless." "Maybe," I replied, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "But we have to try." "Why?" the presence demanded. "I offer you power beyond imagination, revenge against all who have wronged you." "Why choose oblivion over glory?" "Because glory built on suffering isn't glory at all," Amira said. "It's just another form of slavery." The presence laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with the screams of the damned. "You speak of slavery while wearing chains of your own making, your love for each other, your need to protect and be protected. These are bonds as strong as any iron." "You're right," I said, understanding flooding through me. "But some chains are worth wearing." Oh, what happened next would be remembered in whispers and half-forgotten legends for generations to come. Amira and I began to speak in unison, not the words the presence had taught us, but older words, syllables that tasted of starlight and deep earth. As we spoke, the water around us began to glow with a light that seemed to come from within. The presence fought back, sending waves of agony through our shared connection, showing us visions of what we were giving up, a future where we could be free, where we could live and love and grow old together. But we held fast to our purpose, drawing strength from the very bond it sought to use against us. "You cannot do this," the presence raged, its form writhing in the depths. "I am eternal. I am inevitable." "So is love," Amira replied, her voice growing fainter as the binding began to take hold. "So is sacrifice. So is the choice to do what's right, even when it costs everything." The light in the water grew brighter, and I felt myself beginning to dissolve, my consciousness spreading out like ripples on a pond. But instead of fear, I felt peace. We were together, Amira and I, and we would be together always, guardians of a prison that would hold until the end of time. The last thing I saw before the binding claimed us was the presence's true form, shrinking back into the depths, wrapped in chains of light that pulsed with our combined essence. It would remain there, trapped and powerless, until someone else was desperate enough to seek it out. But that would be a problem for another generation, another pair of souls willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for the greater good. As our physical forms dissolved into the swamp water, I felt Amira's hand in mine one last time, and knew that some bonds are stronger than death, stronger than time, stronger than the darkness that seeks to consume all light. The plantation fell silent that morning. The oppressive weight of the presence's influence finally lifted. The remaining slaves found themselves free, not just from supernatural terror, but from the very system that had enslaved them. Master Whitmore, driven mad by the marks we had left on his soul, signed papers freeing every person on the plantation before taking his own life. Cotton Hill was abandoned, left to be reclaimed by the swamp that had always been its true master. But sometimes, on nights when the moon is dark and the mist rises from the water, travelers report seeing two figures standing hand in hand among the cypress trees, guardians watching over a prison that must never be opened. The 42 deaths we were destined to cause never came to pass. Instead, we chose a different ending, one written not in blood, but in love, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bond between two sisters who refused to let darkness win. Some say we're still there, Amira and I, watching and waiting in the space between worlds, and maybe we are. Maybe love really is stronger than death, and maybe some sacrifices echo through eternity, protecting the innocent from horrors they'll never know existed. That's the true story of the Cotton Hill sisters, not monsters, but heroes who paid the ultimate price to save a world that had never shown them mercy. In the end, we found our freedom not in revenge, but in choosing to be better than the darkness that tried to claim us, and that, perhaps, is the most powerful magic of all. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through one of America's darkest and most powerful historical mysteries. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more untold tales from our past. Share it with someone who appreciates deep historical narratives, and let me know in the comments what other dark chapters of history you'd like me to explore. Until next time, remember that even in our darkest moments, we always have a choice. And sometimes, the most powerful choice